Wrestling fans, hello. ProWrestleMachine is back online with another story from the world of wrestling. This is from the Wrestling Observer newsletter. ISSN 10,839,593. February 17, 2003. Curt Hennig, whose career was one of the top wrestlers in the world, ended prematurely with a back injury, saw his life end shockingly under mysterious circumstances in a Brandon, Florida hotel room on February 9. He was 44. Hennig was considered one of the top 5 or 10 wrestlers in North America from 1987 to 1991, during a period where he had lengthy runs with both the AWA World Heavyweight title and the WWF Intercontinental title. Born March 28, 1958, Curt was the son of veteran badass Larry Hennig, a burly 6'3", 300-pounder who wasn't a great worker, but was well respected as being one of the tough guys of his era. Larry started his career as Pretty Boy Larry Hennig, known for his late 1960s tag team with Handsome Harley Race and early 70s tag team with Luscious Lars Anderson. He was known later in his career after turning babyface as the Axe, using a form of clothesline as his finisher. Larry the Axe, who got into real estate and retired often, came back to wrestling to team with his son in the AWA and occasionally in Oregon. While completely different inside the ring, the two were very similar outside the ring in that they kept their families away from wrestling. Hennig had 4 children ranging in age from 12 to 23, and had many interests, such as hunting and fishing, carousing with his friends that were totally unrelated to the business. Curt Hennig was in the Tampa area for a fair show called Jimmy Hart's All-Star Wrestling, which was also to be a taping of a documentary about what happens to former wrestling superstars after the mainstream has left them behind. Hennig, the Nasty Boys, Greg Valentine, Buff Bagwell, Conan and Jim Duggan were among those to be featured in a show they were attempting to sell to the Connie Chung people. Hennig was scheduled in the main event on the show against former British bodybuilding champion Ian Harrison. Hart announced before the show to about 400 fans about the tragedy earlier in the day and did a 10-bell salute before doing the show. Hennig had seen Hart on February 6 when he went to the debut of the Crush promotion, an all-women's group Hart was involved with, that did a television taping in Minneapolis. Over the next few days, from his home he did radio promotional work for Hart's show. He flew into Tampa on the evening of February 8 and went out with several of the wrestlers that he had known seemingly forever, including David Cannell, Cuban Assassin, who he had feuded with dating back to early in both men's careers in Oregon, the Nasty Boys, and Valentine. He was scheduled to go out to breakfast the next morning with Mickey J and some others, and then hit the gym before going to the show. Jay called him at about 9:30 a.m. the next day on his cell phone coming to pick him up at the Homestead Suites Hotel. Hennig said he'd had a lousy night, and for some reason, had to go to the bathroom every hour, and got almost no sleep. He said he wanted to sleep in and would meet with him later in the day. Some time later, Cannell came to the room to pick him up to take him to the gym in Brandon, a Tampa suburb, owned by area wrestler Kevin Donofrio, who works as Cyborg. He called his room and nobody answered. At about 1:30 p.m., Cannell and a few others went back to his room to take him to the fairgrounds. When he didn't answer knocking at the door or shouts to wake up, they asked for a maid to use the pass key to get in. The door was deadbolted shut, but when the door opened, they could see him passed out. They went through a window to get inside and found him not breathing, and immediately called 911. Paramedics were unable to revive him and he was pronounced dead. Results of an autopsy were not available at press time. Police were all over the place investigating, and suspected neither foul play or a suicide, and speculation was that he had suffered a heart attack. He did have a family history of heart trouble, which plagued 2 of his sisters. While not having a drug reputation, he was a product of wrestling in the 80s, which meant steroids, and in particular downers, and a fondness for drinking and raising hell. Bret Hart, who spoke to his wife that evening, said that she noted Curt had been having problems with what he described as hiccups and a chest cold that wouldn't go away for nearly 2 weeks, but he had not gotten checked by a doctor. Those who were with him the night before said he described his problem as uncontrollable belching. Hennig followed his father and older brother Randy at Robbinsdale High School in the Minneapolis suburb of Robbinsdale. His father and brother were excellent high school wrestlers. The irony of Curt, who was most famous playing Mr. Perfect, a so-called perfect athlete who could compete at the top level in every sport, was that he was as great an athletic pro wrestler as there was during his heyday, but in a business where probably 40% of the stars were top athletes, he was really not a standout in any sport. He lost as many matches as he won as a 154 and 167-pounder wrestler in high school. His father wanted Randy, who was a high school contemporary of people like Ric Flair, Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell in the area, to be a pro wrestler, but he had no interest in it. Curt gravitated to it, and became the pride of his father. As it turned out, 4 members of the Robbinsdale High Class of 1976 became pro wrestlers: Hennig, his best friend since the age of 13, Rick Rude, along with Dean Peters, who wrestled as Brady Boone, Firecat and Battlecat, and Tom Zenk. Of those, only Zenk will be alive for his 45th birthday. Rude, ravishing Rick Rude, whose father, Dick, was longtime friends with Larry, passed away at the age of 40 on April 20, 1999 of a drug overdose. Lethal doses of more than one painkiller were found in his system. Rude, who had been under contract with WCW, was training for an in-ring comeback with WWF, and had bulked up considerably before his death. Peters' career as an active wrestler had ended due to injuries when he took the spot of Brian Hildebrand as a referee for WCW. While driving from a TV taping in Palmetto, Florida on December 15, 1998, back home to Tampa, he apparently fell asleep at the wheel and his car went over an embankment and he was killed, also at the age of 40. Graduating the next from the same school were Barry Darsow, Demolition Smash, Repo Man, Crusher Khrushchev, John Nor, Berserker, Nor the Barbarian, and Scott Simpson, Nikita Koloff. Hennig and Nor in particular remained good friends, and had a regular Sunday night date where they'd hang out together and hit the local bar scene. Hennig was known in wrestling for a wild lifestyle, and being something of the life of a party and a master ribber. His last major job in wrestling, a 5-month tenure in WWF where they did nothing with him, ended this past June when he drank too much on a flight coming back from England, and started harassing Brock Lesnar, leading to something of an amateur wrestling confrontation on what later was to be known as the Plane Fight from Hell. He once put rotten cream cheese packets in my wrestling shoes, and they still kind of smell, remembered former New Japan wrestler Brian Johnston, who along with Don Fry trained for pro wrestling with Hennig and Wayne Bloom in 1997 and 1998 at Brad Reingen's camp. He had been around the business so long he knew every rib in the book, and it was almost impossible to rib him back. Some were harmless fun, but they weren't all like that. Hennig was legendary for taking dumps in people's clothes, cutting up clothes with scissors. The entire out-of-the-ring feud between Dynamite Kid and Jacques Rougeau actually started when Hennig cut up the Rougeau clothes with scissors and went to the bathroom when the Rougeaus came in, and blamed Dynamite and Davey Boy Smith. An argument ensued, and then a fight, with Dynamite doing a number on Jacques' face. Jacques, after his face healed but his pride hadn't, stewed for a few weeks before sucker-punching Dynamite with a roll of coins, knocking his teeth out. In 1998, when Ultimate Warrior was being brought in by WCW with a trapdoor gimmick, Hennig, Warrior, and Scott Norton all had to hide under the ring for a planned angle. Hennig took a dump under the ring, causing Norton to throw up and Warrior to get sick, since they had to stay under the ring, and stinking out everyone at ringside. Away from wrestling and to an extent inside the ring itself, he was like a younger version of Ric Flair during his heyday, as he was a great bump taker who everyone loved to wrestle because he made them look better than just about anyone else. And outside the ring, he loved to drink all night. He had the reputation as someone who could get totally wasted, and come back the next night and deliver a 4-stars match. While he wrestled on and off for 23 years, that peak period was really from November 21, 1986 in Las Vegas through August 26, 1991 in Madison Square Garden. When Hart appeared on Wrestling Observer Live last year and was asked if he could wrestle one last match, who would he like it to be, he surprisingly said Hennig, who wrestled Hart at SummerSlam in 1991 in Madison Square Garden and dropped the IC title to him in what, up to that point in time, was Hart's most important match of his career. He was among the best pure workers ever, said Hart. He won't be remembered as the biggest draw or most exciting personality, but maybe he was the best when it comes to being a guy you would wrestle where everything looks snug. He would take great bumps to make you look good, but he was light as a feather. Hart recalled when working with Hennig, that when Hennig would stomp on his chest, it looked like he was kicking the hell out of him, but it felt like somebody was dropping a grape on his chest. The two loved to party, starting off with beer and ending with Hennig's favorite Jack Daniels, and often they'd get so hungover on the road during the days of literally insane travel. Both worked more than 285 dates per year and more than 300 matches during that period, that they'd agree to not do much in the ring the next night. But they had a chemistry to where, once they locked up, they'd do their match. The two did the same basic series of spots and bumps, largely in order, starting in the spring of 1989 nearly every night for months, and on occasion for 2 years, leading to their most famous match ever at the 1991 SummerSlam, in what was the company's best in-ring singles program in many years. Hennig was known as a good young babyface almost from his first match in the ring, which was on January 30, 1980 against Billy Howard. He was trained by Vern Gagne, surviving the famed Hell Camp that ran off about 90% of those who started. Of course, Hennig, as a second-generation wrestler and son of an AWA legend, did have its advantages as he was groomed in camp instead of beaten into quitting. After working some matches as a rookie in the AWA, he was sent on the road to gain experience to eventually come back as a player. His first stop was to work for Vince McMahon Sr. in 1981. He was only about 210 pounds at the time. He was tall and skinny in a promotion built on powerful physiques. Hennig was the territory's top babyface jobber in no time flat. He'd rarely win on television. But the veteran heels of the era such as Ray Stevens, Don Morocco, Greg Valentine, Bob Orton, Jimmy Snuka or Buddy Rose would sell more for him than anyone else on TV, and crowds always got into his comebacks. He was already a good bump taker and a high flyer, with one of the best drop kicks in wrestling. He may have been the first American wrestler, and certainly the first in the Northeast, to regularly utilize the missile dropkick. The maneuver, innovative at the time, would send crowds into a frenzy as he'd get near falls on the top stars that fans thought would be the night where they would finally see the big upset. He even had a spectacular television match when Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama, was brought in as WWF Junior Heavyweight Champion, and often teamed with third-generation wrestler Eddie Gilbert, who became another of his later best friends in wrestling to have tragic ends. His career took him to Oregon, where he became a main event babyface, holding the Northwest Heavyweight title for 4 months in 1983, as well as the tag team title both with his father and later with Pat McGee, better known as Scott McGee, whose career ended early after suffering a stroke. Oregon was probably the best place in wrestling to learn, as he wrestled 6 or 7 nights per week, working 15 to 25 minutes per match, and doing weekly interviews. It was a hot period in the territory as Hennig worked regularly with the likes of Rose and Dynamite Kid, who were two very different kinds of great heel workers. He had many spectacular matches by the standards of that era, and while you could see the flashes in his first WWF stay, people usually didn't talk about 23-year-old job guys as great workers. In Oregon, he became a great territorial babyface, but the feeling was he was too white meat, clean-cut and good-looking, and small and physically, to headline a major circuit. When he returned to the AWA, the idea was to put him in the role of a rising clean-cut babyface. The local product fans would see rise to where he could be a frequent challenger for the world title. He wasn't thought of yet as championship caliber, and one of his first programs did him no good. The Road Warriors, who were the hottest tag team act in the business, and arguably the hottest at this point in the history of the business, came to the AWA shortly after making a big name on national TV out of Atlanta, but the promotion was purchased by Vince McMahon and the new company didn't offer enough to keep them as regulars. AWA promoter Vern Gage was hard hit by losses to WWF of so many of his biggest stars, most notably Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, Ken Patera, and Bobby Heenan, and brought in the Road Warriors and Bruiser Brody to save the ship from sinking. The Warriors were booked as heels, and Curt and Larry Hennig were frequent foes as a father and son team. But the Warriors were so charismatic, plus they never sold and looked and worked like superheroes, so they killed every babyface in the territory. They didn't sell for Curt because he was too small, believe it or not, and there may have also been an underlying grudge dating back to a rumble among rival high schools when Hennig knocked out a much smaller Mike Hegstrand, Hawk, with a sucker punch. Hennig at the time joked that if he had any idea how big Hawk was going to get, he'd have never done it, but the ring was the payback. The Warriors didn't even like selling for Larry, who was in his late 40s by this time, more than 300 pounds and a longtime legend. But they did learn quickly to sell for Larry. This program hurt Hennig badly. The attempt to give him a pulse as a babyface came by teaming him with Scott Hall in late 1985. At the time, the Gagnes thought that Hall, because he was the same height as Hogan, wasn't quite as huge but had a better physique, was a better athlete and they thought, was better looking. The truth was, promoters at the time wanting to find someone to compete with Hogan, were drooling over Hall as the next big thing. Gagne thought he was the guy they could build up to become the babyface to carry the territory. There was one huge problem. Hall, who had only 2 years' experience at the time, may have looked like then TV heartthrob Tom Selleck. They even considered naming him Magnum SH, since Magnum TA had become a huge hit in the Carolinas, but settled for Magnum Scott Hall until the nickname died a quickly and merciful death. But he was a klutz in the ring and had almost no charisma, as funny as that sounds today. They paired Hall with Hennig as a team, since Hennig was going nowhere but they knew he was a good worker. The idea was Hennig would work almost the entire match and carry the team to good matches, and in the process, make Hall a superstar. The two ended up being handed the tag team titles when Steve Regal, no relation to the British wrestler, who held the titles with Jimmy Garvin, quit the company to join the WWF. A fictitious match and result was announced for Albuquerque, New Mexico, which at the time was a city where numerous bouts that never took place seemed to happen in. Hall never did make the grade until many years later as Razor Ramon, and the AWA eventually gave up on him. But thrust into the spotlight, Hennig's career revived. It ended up being Hennig, by this time around 235 to 240 pounds, that would be the guy that would come close but never capture the brass ring in matches against then AWA champion Nick Bockwinkel. Their most famous meeting was on November 21, 1986 at the Showboat Pavilion in Las Vegas, where the faltering AWA was still selling out for its TV tapings in a building with great atmosphere. In a match that ended up airing late on New Year's Eve on ESPN and drew shockingly high ratings, became one of the classic television battles of the decade, the nearly 52-year-old champion in his final classic battle to a bloody 60-minute draw. There was no denying Hennig's ability as a future superstar and probable future world champion at that point. The WWF came calling at this point, and Hennig agreed to go. The Gagnes, having lost so much talent to the WWF at this point, promised Hennig the AWA title, something he'd grown up on, if he agreed to stay. But more importantly, Hennig was becoming one of the last old-school carnies, and he was learning all the important tricks of that life, and of maneuvering as a main event pro wrestler. Fast forward to Super Clash 2 at the Cow Palace in San Francisco on May 2, 1987. By this point in time, the AWA was in rough shape. Bockwinkel was turned babyface since their famous match months earlier, after being turned on by Larry Zbyszko for a title program. But the big show, a much-hyped ESPN taping and billed as the company's biggest show of the year, was headlined by a face-versus-face confrontation with Hennig. The show drew just 2,800 fans, less than half of what the promotion was expecting. To give an immediate indication something was up, they brought in the late Stanley Blackburn, the prototypical old-school company president who played the role of a befuddled but wise man, whose rulings, that always made logical sense, still ended up screwing the faces, to ringside, along with Larry Zbyszko's, who was Bockwinkel's leading rival at the time, and Ray Stevens, who was Bockwinkel's longtime tag partner and the local wrestling legend. After a series of near falls in what built to being a very good match, with the crowd 98% behind Hennig as the young challenger, Zbyszko handed Hennig a roll of dimes and Hennig KO'd Bockwinkel and pinned him in 26 minutes of a 3 stars half match. Even with the obvious heel finish, the live crowd, thinking they saw a title switch, erupted in cheers, which was not the reaction expected. In fact, Stevens was brought out specifically to garner the opposite reaction. Stevens and Blackburn told ref Gary DeRusha what happened, leading to it being announced the title was held up, making it probably the only time fans booed Stevens at the Cow Palace over the previous 18 years. The fans even cheered wildly when Hennig shook hands with Zbyszko, completing his heel turn. The idea was that they were grooming Hennig, after establishing him as a heel, to win the title from Bockwinkel a few months down the line at a Summer Spectacular. But Hennig had other plans. Before the match, when word was out Hennig was being primed for a big push, the WWF started negotiations with him again, since Hennig had yet to get that promised title belt. The idea was agreed upon that Hennig, who was tired of waiting for what had been promised him for 6 months, would do the match, beat the champion on television, and even though he wouldn't get the title, he would disappear and show up on WWF TV, thus embarrassing the AWA one more time. The company had huge plans for Hennig as a wrestling babyface since Ricky Steamboat was falling out of favor when he asked to take a leave of absence as IC champion. The AWA had made a deal at the same time to try and make its champion what the NWA champion had been before Jim Crockett Jr. pulled Ric Flair from the rest of the circuits. Gagne made a deal where the 4 remaining NWA regional offices that hadn't gone out of business, Central States, CWA in Memphis, Pacific Northwest and Continental, would recognize an AWA singles and tag team champions, making it actually the title recognized at the time by the most different wrestling promotions. AWA, after completing that deal, quickly forgot about its belt being held up, as Bockwinkel went to Memphis, Louisville and Kansas City the next week to defend the title. Larry Hennig pressured Curt to once again back out of his deal with the WWF when the Gagnes agreed to change the storyline and simply announce the Cow Palace match as a title change. On May 23, 1987, more than 2 weeks after the match, it was announced that the championship committee had voted 4-2 that since there was no evidence of a conspiracy between Hennig and Zbyszko, and that the films couldn't show conclusively that Hennig had used a foreign object to beat Bockwinkel, the tape was shot with that idea on purpose to explain why Bockwinkel simply wasn't getting the belt back, that Hennig was the champion. The last hurrah for the AWA title belt was on May 9, 1988, when Jerry Lawler announced that he would finally win the elusive world title for Memphis, or retire that night. and beat Hennig before 8,000 fans after guest ref Jackie Fargo counted 3 after Hennig was slingshotted into the ring post. The idea was that Hennig would get the title back very quickly in a rematch. But when that didn't happen, he once again started negotiating with WWF. This time he went. There is a wrestling myth that Curt Hennig and Terry Taylor, who both started with WWF in July of 1988, were both up for the berth as Mr. Perfect and the Red Rooster. They were both considered top 10 workers in the US. One got the main event gimmick, and the other had his career ruined. It's not close to true. Both did debut at the same time, but there were no ideas for either of them when they were first signed. By September, Hennig was asking friends to give him an idea for a gimmick because WWF didn't want Curt Hennig, great in-ring performer. A bunch of ideas were batted around, including Curtis Mayhem, the name his friend from AWA days, Paul Heyman, suggested for him before. Late in the month, someone came up with the idea of Mr. Perfect. Falling on the heels of the successful $1 Million Man gimmick the previous year for Ted DiBiase, he was introduced by a series of vignettes. He would be shown playing various sports, and using either trick photography or a million takes, supposedly bowling 300, hitting a hole-in-one in golf, hitting mid-court shots on the basketball court, who in pool hitting every ball in the pocket on a break. Perhaps the campiest was when he threw a pass 50 yards and then caught it himself, always ending by saying he was the perfect athlete. Mr. Perfect was born, and probably would have died quickly if someone other than a great wrestler was put in the role. Hennig turned out to be the right guy to a degree. The initial success of Mr. Perfect is also better remembered than it actually was. When he finally showed up at arena events, it was to little reaction. He was supposed to be a heel, but the skits made everyone know who he was and intrigued by him, but did nothing to make people hate him, as the company thought simply him calling himself Perfect would do. His fast track to the top for matches with Hulk Hogan was slowed down greatly. Instead, he wound up mainly winning prelim matches using his Perfect Plex, later called the Hennig Plex, a fisherman's suplex made famous in Japan by Kuniaki Kobayashi. While Hennig credited Harley Race, who used the move in the WWF before Hennig, for the move, it was actually suggested to him just before he went on a tour with All Japan in 1988 as AWA champion for a match with Tiger Mask, Mitsuharu Misawa. Japanese reporter Jimmy Suzuki told him that his axe finisher wouldn't cut it in Japan, and the fisherman suplex came up, although even then, some were against the idea of a world champion using a move made famous by a mid-card wrestler from a rival promotion. Of course, by the time he hit WWF, that wasn't a political issue. After beating the Blue Blazer, Owen Hart, in a disappointing match at the disappointing WrestleMania V show, he wound up programmed with Bret Hart. While both were being pushed, there was more investment in Hennig because the idea was always to eventually get to Hulk Hogan versus Mr. Perfect, even if it was going to come a lot later than originally planned, so he was supposed to go over in the matches. I was let down because I was starting to get a singles push and they wanted him to go over, remembered Hart. He told the agents on the first night that he didn't want to beat me. We worked out a match where we'd do a 20 minutes Broadway, and I'd ask for 5 more minutes. He'd refuse. I'd turn around and he would beat the crap out of me. I'd make a comeback. He loved that ending and insisted on doing it every night. He thought it got him more heat than he'd get beating me. It was an amazing gesture at the time. The program ended up establishing Hart as a higher-level single star, and the time it was over, Hennig was deemed ready for his program being fed to Hogan. But it didn't start out as it seemed. By this point, Hennig and Hart were considered right at the top of the list of the best in-ring workers in the company. When the company decided to go with the program, a lot of people were talking about it, and the first night, most of the wrestlers on the card stopped what they were doing to watch the match. "We had a stinkeroo," said Hart. "A 20-minute Broadway. We couldn't get it going. We were both way off. The crowd was flat. We struggled through the match and even messed up some of our spots. We both came back to the dressing room hanging our heads. I think we both looked at each other and thought, he's not nearly as good as I thought." It ended up a lot better the second night. While everyone remembers the SummerSlam match as a classic, neither thought it was their best match. Hart remembered the top bout between the two being one night in Anchorage. He also remembered tearing down the house in Sacramento, at which point Hogan felt Hennig was ready for the big program. "We did the exact same match on and off for a year," said Hart. "The same spots, almost identical. We did almost the same match at SummerSlam 2 years later." But while Mr. Perfect carried Hulk Hogan to some of his best matches ever as WWF champion, it was not a big drawing program. Their first Madison Square Garden meeting on January 15, 1990 drew 11,500 fans, the smallest crowd for a Hogan title defense up to that point in time, and a later tag match with Hogan and Brutus Beefcake vs. Perfect and the Genius, then manager Lanny Poffo, came back with 13,800. Aside from drawing one major house, a near sellout for a handicap match with Hennig and Genius vs. Hogan in Los Angeles that nearly sold out the sports arena, it was a disappointment at the gate. His program with Ultimate Warrior drew even less, although he was good enough that he was able to get a lot more out of a Warrior match than most. It turned out to be one of the reasons the decision was made Warrior as champion wasn't working. On October 19, 1990, MSG show headlined by the Texas Tornado vs. Mr. Perfect for the IC title drew 5,500 fans, the company's worst crowd in its premier arena in 21 years. The failure of Perfect on top to be a big draw, even though he was arguably the company's best wrestler at that point, was blamed on him selling so much that he made everyone look good, but people didn't believe he had the ability to beat the superhero babyfaces, who never even sold offensive moves, put over by guys who looked stronger. After Ultimate Warrior, the IC champ, won the WWF title from Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 6, a tournament was held for the vacant title. Mr. Perfect, by this point managed by Bobby Heenan, pinned former champ Tito Santana in the finals at a TV taping on April 23, 1990 in Austin, Texas. When Heenan first gave up managing, Perfect was managed for a short period of time by the coach, a failed gimmick for 70s star John Tolos. He dropped the title on August 27, 1990 to the Texas Tornado, a rapidly fading Kerry Von Erich, but Von Erich ended up as a failure and Perfect got it back on November 19, 1990. His biggest program before Hart, in 1991, came with the Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, who out of the ring turned out to be one of his best friends and running buddies. Hennig, after his match in Tampa on February 9, was scheduled to go to Georgia and spend a few days hanging out with Traylor. In those days, plans for title changes more often than not were formulated months in advance. The company had already decided to start pushing Hart as a single and having him beat Perfect for the IC title on August 27, 1991 in Madison Square Garden, weeks before Perfect suffered the injury that ended his career as one of the best in the business. He already had bad knees, and all the bumps were taking their toll on his back. Hennig claimed he was taking a whip into turnbuckles that weren't aligned correctly when his back went out in a match in late June, some 9 weeks before he was to drop the title. He suffered a broken tailbone along with a bulging disc in his lower back. He was supposed to be out of action for an indefinite period of time. McMahon, who a few years earlier had literally had Dynamite Kid go to the ring in a wheelchair so the tag titles would be dropped in the ring, insisted to Hennig that he come back for the pay-per-view match because in those days he had the attitude that titles had to at all costs change hands inside the ring. McMahon told Hennig he could do a 1 or 2 minute match if he had to. He just wanted Hart to get the win inside the ring as opposed to Hennig forfeiting the title, but after a few months off, when he showed up in New York, he decided to go out with a bang. Hennig came back with a show-stopping performance that many considered the company's best match since the Randy Savage vs. Ricky Steamboat WrestleMania match 4 years earlier. Perfect tapped out to Hart's sharpshooter in 1803, which also got the holdover completely as a submission that worked on the major stars, and Hart was off and running. At the time, it was unclear if Hennig would ever wrestle again. He was advised at one point to have major back surgery, or perhaps even spinal fusion. He never had the surgery. He ended up replacing Heenan, who felt he couldn't do an adequate job as a manager due to his neck problems, as Ric Flair's manager. Later, when the company was left in a lurch when Warrior and Davey Boy Smith were fired, he was brought back as a babyface to work against Flair, including the January 18, 1993 match, which aired 1 week later, at the Manhattan Center in a loser leaves town match which many credit as the match that put Monday Night Raw on the map, with a high-stakes main event on the second episode of the show. Hennig wrestled on and off for the next 10 years, most notable for collecting a huge settlement on a Lloyd's of London insurance claim for a career-ending back injury. He had several retirements from the injury, and several comebacks. He was a lot bigger and thicker, but sacrificed in mobility, ranging in weight from 245 in his best shape, to probably 265 to 270. He understood the business of his father, and of his early career, but old-school wrestling that he learned was dead, and he didn't like it. But he did a great job in playing the game of making money. While collecting insurance money, he was able to double down, working as a manager or a TV announcer for WWE, and staying as a major player in the spotlight much of the time. He'd get himself back into the picture, such as the time he did a long build-up for a match with Triple H that was supposed to put Triple H over, and on the eve of the match, jumped to WCW for $750,000 per year. He did nothing of note and showed his talents just enough so you knew that he had them when he wanted to show them, but didn't care to do that all that often. He did get a couple of title reigns, holding the WCW tag titles and US belts when they meant a whole lot less than his IC title of years earlier that he's far better remembered for. He was out there to have fun, and in WCW, frustrated as everyone was with being part of the product, became a major part of the party atmosphere that wasn't conducive to productivity. He even had a comeback as a cult babyface, even though he was meant to be a heel and not meant to get over, as part of the West Texas Rednecks, getting airplay on some country stations for the song Rap is Crap. His last major move was being groomed by the XWF in late 2001 as their top heel, including bumping like crazy one last time for Hogan. This ended up being the impetus for WWF surprisingly bringing back Mr. Perfect for one day only, apparently just to mess with XWF, and shockingly pushing him as one of the final three in last year's Royal Rumble, allowing him to hold his own at the end with the company's big guns, Steve Austin, Triple H and Kurt Angle. For that match, he looked like he had found the fountain of youth and the Mr. Perfect people had fondly remembered but hadn't seen in years was still alive and kicking. That garnered him a contract, leaving XWF holding the bag with a bunch of tapings built around a guy who wasn't there. It was almost apropos in negotiations with Hennig because of how it mirrored the attempts they had unsuccessfully at first made to sign Hennig a generation earlier. But a week later, after signing him up, they seemed to give up on him. He didn't do anything to make any sort of an impact before eventually being fired 5 months later. While he was able to script the late 80s inside the ring to be one of the game's best performers, and able to script the 90s, well, aside from the deaths of so many of his close friends, even more impressively outside the ring by conning the system to make a ton of money while having more time with his family than almost anyone else. Ultimately, his ending couldn't have been scripted worse. His last run on NWA TNA, where he didn't look like he cared a great deal, ended on January 8th with a forgettable pole match with David Flair where he decided to not even climb the pole to win in a 2-minute match, was hardly the way he would have wanted to go out if he could have scripted it.